last day of classes. I'm so happy to see such a large crowd. We're going to try to move quickly today and see if we can finish up a little early because I'm sure you guys have lots of things to do. It's a beautiful day outside. So what we're going to do today is talk through 3 projects that are fairly far along. And talk about things like, how do you get the project started, who's involved, how do you find funding, do you need funding? So some of the key questions we're going to try to hit today are, for example, if you're going to involve students, how is that going to work? If you're going to involve community members, how is that going to work? If you apply for funding, how much work do you have to do before you apply for funding? So we're going to try to hit those questions in different ways. With the different projects. And so we have Carrie Brando, who is the professor of anthropology and the chair of anthropology. And I'm so happy that she has agreed to be a member of our group because I do think a lot of the times the social sciences are just, quite far ahead of us in terms of collaborative research, working with teams. So I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. So what we'll do is we'll do each presentation. Oh, sorry. And also, we need to send the sheet around and everybody sign it. We don't necessarily need your email address, but we do need to know who's here for funding purposes. So yes, each presenter will present for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to take questions after each one because I think you're probably going to have very specific questions. If you do have questions during the presentation, as long as they're quite specific, that works too.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to be one of the speakers. First, when you were saying you were welcoming everyone to the course, but I thought you welcomed them to the Digital Humanities course. But that is how I have felt this whole time. I felt like an imposter in this group, and I've learned so much about what Digital Humanities is. So thank you for even allowing me to be part of this group, because maybe after the presentation you'll wonder what this anthropologist was doing in the mix. So I'm just going to talk not so much about my actual research, but I love talking about it, so if anybody wants to talk about that, we can. And more just like the practicalities of involving students along the way in collaborating virtually with partners in Honduras and partners in Colorado and partners in our classrooms here on campus. So the roadmap here is, I'll give you a very brief overview of the kind of work that I do and a variety of very quick examples of how I've embedded research in classes. So I know this is a slightly different kind of take on the presentations here. And then I'll talk in a specific and general way about how we have collaborated and I'll tell you who the we is later in terms of data analysis. Are you trying to make that a little darker? Yeah. Good, because there are certain things you won't be able to see. And then creating a video. All right, so just a tiny, you can't even see that print. I work in Honduras, and I'm an environmental anthropologist. I do sort of feminist political ecology work. That's the only frame I'm going to give you about the work that I do. But I am out of a commitment to feminist methodologies. I'm committed to an engaged, collaborative kind of scholarship, which is something that the university embraces here, an engaged scholarship agenda. So to that end, I like to, as much as possible, meet people where they are in terms of designing projects, as well as bringing students into a research process. I've been working in this particular region, and I've sort of blew it up since 2000. And what I'm going to tell you about, though, is work that I've been doing since 2011 on what I consider a new project, and I know students don't think it's new when you talk to them about 2011, but 2011 through today, so building blocks on that. I've been in partnership in the Bay Islands, which are English-speaking islands off the coast of Honduras, in partnership with 5 different conservation organizations. My own work is on theorizing multi-species conservation volunteerism. Won't say anything more about that, unless you want to. But because of my commitment to engagement, I am very responsive to whatever organizations want us to do. So every time I get an ask for how can you leverage your skill set and resources, I'm like, okay, I'll figure this out, and we'll pull students in to try to meet your needs. So the first project I'm going to very quickly tell you about is the organizations that I work with. Most conservation organizations are reliant on paying volunteers, usually people like the students we teach in our classes who go, travel, volunteer to advance the work of an organization or a nonprofit in another place. In 2015, I co-taught a class. So 2011, I started building this longer-term project. 2015, I co-taught a class with Arlene Hill and Earth Sciences. I had already agreed to embed a research project for my partners, and then I got a course buyout for a different class. And so I had to come up to Arlene and say, hey, can you allow me to slap this class, slap this project into the class? And she was so gracious, and we did. And so what the project was our conservationists wanted to know a little bit more about their volunteers so they could improve their volunteering program. So these are some of our friends. That's their Skype. So this is sort of the practicality, like how did we do a virtual project? It's a gender, environment, feminist, environmental anthro kind of class. Feminist critical geography class. We created a survey where students were able to bring the questions they were learning in the class to bear on the research design. And so they asked a number of questions that got at their interest. And then we asked a number of practical questions. So we collaboratively, via Skype, Skyped in our partners from TILA every other week, and we worked together to design a project. That's probably all I'll tell you about that. Students conducted all the analysis, they presented it back, they loved it. The reason I'm telling you about this class is because it was a springboard for others. These are just some student reflections. They were very moved. If you haven't embedded a real project in a class where students are talking face to face, even if they're miles and miles away, and seeing the impact of their work, there's a lot of tears along the way. They're very stressed out. The students were all freaked out about it for a long time, and then they gave this presentation, they saw the real value, they got some feedback on it. It was a very positive experience. Takeaway from this is I've done this kind of stuff before in Memphis with one-off partners, and it's not as effective. So having a long-term relationship and partnership in place, because students mess up a lot. And we all mess up a lot, right? But there needs to be that forgiving partnership along the way, and all the support that comes along with it. The students presented stuff back, but it needed a lot more work. It wasn't really ready for prime time, and then we needed to extend that, like the faculty partners later. Anyway, we used this project, so this is one segue into funding. We used this project to collect some initial data that we then used and parlayed into a collaborative conservation grant that we got through Colorado State, which introduces one of my other partners, an old friend from Colorado State, another anthropologist. Long story short, we wanted to do a project together, okay? And she works in Central America. So she had access to this funding pool. We drew on this past class data. We applied for a grant that was going to look at the relationship between local livelihoods, conservation organizations, and volunteer knowledge of human and ecological landscapes. This was going to involve field work on the ground, and then followed by data collection virtually. So this was on the ground work. We brought a couple different students from each of our universities to Honduras, collected a ton of data, and this is where we enter one software program. If you haven't worked in it, we can talk a little bit about that. So what this meant was we collected all this data between Honduras, Colorado, and Memphis, and we had to figure out how we're going to analyze a bunch of video documents, video, photos, interviews, audio, all sorts of that. So has anybody worked in qualitative data management before, software programs? Some. So I will show you, and I linked it in here if we want to share it out, but you can Google it. You don't have to necessarily read this, but I have in the past been using Atlas TI, which is a very common one. In Vivo is the one that many of you may know. We have that one on campus. We do have some Atlas TI. Debooz, that's a cloud-based program. There are all these comparison charts, so if you are looking to work with qualitative data management, I would recommend linking and pulling up to see what serves your need. Right here, you can't quite see it, but for us, how the teamwork piece was important. So there's cost, teamwork, capacity, and so forth. But we were going to have to work back and forth. Some of the cloud-based systems allow you to go in there and simultaneously code data. We, for a variety of reasons, decided that MaxQDA, and we both had to migrate to a new software to do this, Suzanne and I, was going to be the best for our purposes. And in order to do that, this is just a practical tip for you if you ever go towards this, is you have to sequence your coding. So she and I were coding all of our data, and I would have to say, I'm going to code from 8 to 11, and then I'm going to put it into a Dropbox, and you're going to pull it down, and you're going to code, 11 to 12. So we couldn't do it simultaneously. MaxQDA, there's a link here. Oh, I did also want to tell you, Anthropology now owns, we have 22 copies on portable sticks that is available to social science departments, but I think it would be fair to also make it available to some of you all. So if you have a class or a project and you want to borrow, we do have that available in our department. So a portable license, which is really nice. Downside of doing this was our Honduran colleagues could not view it because we had it across the U.S. institutions. You cannot see this, but this is just a screenshot to show you what the coding looks like. And if you are familiar with qualitative coding, you can build a whole code book. You can do all sorts of exciting things. You dump your documents. It's extremely intuitive. It's an overview of codes. I didn't realize how small it would look when I put stuff up there. I want to point out one of the ways in which we communicated virtually was this use of memos, so like sticky notes, and they're really easy to follow within MaxQDA. So Suzanne and I would write notes to each other, like, hey, I'm going to collapse this code into this code, or this one here is operationalizing the code. This is when we're discussing the original families. Someone would say, I'm also including these people who were born and raised when they're descended from Utilian, and so forth. So we'd be able to memo back and forth. We were telling each other some other things there. One of the outcomes, just sort of the practical outcomes, there's a book, it's marvelous, but that's for another talk. One of the practical outcomes that we produced was action plans out of this grant for our conservation partners. So how do you improve your programming that's going to close that gap between volunteer knowledge and local livelihoods? And we always translate everything in Spanish as well, because part of the island is Spanish speaking. And then we would tailor things by request. If one organization wanted, and I know nothing about this, but how do we build a financially sustainable model? And so we did the best that we could to try to help them reach financial sustainability for their volunteer program. All right, that leaves us, so that then parlayed into a 2017 project. One of the things that we learned from the 2015 and then the 2016-2017 study was a disconnect between volunteers' understanding of the local historical context and the actual environmental threats on the island. So people don't actually know what the endangered species are, and they're supposed to be there to protect them, for instance. Another gap is this, and the reason I say the language shift story there, this is interesting to me. I was with a volunteer. This is an island that had historically spoken Spanish because they're British descendants, but it's off mainland Honduras, right? And now there's a lot of political instability in Honduras, so more and more people are migrating over this island. So this one volunteer, I think, captured it all, where they're like, this is so sad to see this culture change on this island. They're losing their Spanish when you hear all this English. But anybody who knows the place knows that the the spike in Spanish, what's actually being lost is Creole English, right? And so that just illustrates how little the students know when they're showing up. And anyway, so our task that was given to us by organizations was to design a training, a training for volunteers that explains the cultural history of the place and the environmental threats and best practices for volunteering. Like, people are modest in this place, don't walk around in your bikinis and that kind of, they wanted that kind of stuff. So we had another class in 2017 that was their task. So every time I embed a project in a class for them to do the practical piece, right? And so they built, and this is their PowerPoint, the class produced a PowerPoint on the history of the place that now all the organizations can train up, and there's a script that goes along with it, their volunteers, and onboard them before they show up. Anyway, that's sort of one of the outcomes. And the way we did that was, yet again, we're Skyping in people from the place, and we're having conversations that way. This then led to the most recent project. This will be the last one. So that was 2017, and I'm visiting Montilla with a nice friend, Pamela, and we're having, I think, probably a glass of wine. And she said, what I've always wanted to see in this place is a community-led film. A film because we're losing our heritage was her narrative, right? And I had done a project like this in the Beltline community in Memphis where we trained youth who then interviewed their elders and turned it into a small documentary. And I use that in quotes because I have no skill set in this area. So we modeled after that. And because our university, Mary, wouldn't let us use certain funds and leave equipment on the island, they started a GoFundMe page, and so they bought iPads, and we trained up. These are some of our partners. There are people in there. You can see my skill set in terms of. All right, so we created this project where these young people were trained in doing qualitative interviewing. These are some of my partners. And they went off and they interviewed all their elders. This was the training manual that we created. That's the launch. That's me and some of the reef leaders, they're called. And we structured it where my graduate assistant partnered with someone sort of her level. And then we had the organizational leads right at the top, and then the grads were coordinating things. They trained these young reef leaders who then went out and did video interviews with an iPad. This is a picture from Instagram. This is from their Instagram, and then they made an Instagram page on the island. So the way in which we did this in terms of data ownership, I think this is important in digital humanities, was the organization I partnered with made it all public. Like they own the data and they've given us access. So they own the data, gained consent from islanders, they've given access rights to my colleague and I to use in our analysis and our work. They still followed all their informed consent processes anyhow. So challenges of doing this kind of work was on an island that has really crappy Wi-Fi. We had set up a Google Cloud and we couldn't get the stuff on it. The videos were too heavy. So we actually had to have people smuggle the data, this reel, off the island and then transfer it to, again, it's Vika's owned cloud, but somebody had to physically get off the island every time to transfer the digital data. And we had thought that the young people on the island, we bought an app called Memos. Does anyone use that? It's supposed to be, and it is easy. It's like an iMovie, but it's on an iPad. And so we bought them this app and thought that the kids would be able to create their own films, which was wrong. It was a little too difficult for them to handle it. There's complications with an iPad. You're using your fingers to edit stuff, and that's really difficult, plus the time and other constraints. So what we ended up doing was expanded. This is just the last year. We expanded our team. That's my GA, and I've got 3 undergrads now. And we communicate and we meet weekly by Skype and WhatsApp with the young people that we're partnering with on the island of Honduras. And this team here created our final product. It's actually in the final. I was going to try to show some, but I'm not going to have time. So they just finished the final wrap on this little film. It's called Our Voices. And one key, this is just practical stuff. One key thing that has been really helpful is WhatsApp, right? It's the easiest way to communicate internationally. They're constantly responding. So just a couple days ago, they're writing back and forth about what to put in there. We had students time stamping, so we had transcribed everything, but we had them time stamp and then check against one another, so what are the themes? So they coded the data that way. That's just an example. And then they had this color scheme that they were talking about environmental stuff and so forth, the key quotes they would pull out. All right, so that's the final edit. We ended up having to move it into iMovie because the Luma Vision was really troublesome. So I moved it into iMovie. The final edit is literally happening right now. And the next steps are I'm going to then return an individual interview to every person that participated on Island on a flash drive, as well as the film. And we're going to, that's going to happen in the next couple months. That's it, I think. I don't know.
Comments?
Oh, that's just a swamper. Some turtles. It's not necessary. I don't know why it was in there, but I kept it.
So it was one organization or like a collaborative set of nonprofits?
Yeah, so each project is different. So I collaborate with all of them on different projects. This particular one is one organization, Our Voices. One organization, they have a Leaf Leader program, youth leaders that they're trained to be eco leaders on the islands and go into ecotourism. That's the group, that's the kids that we're collaborating with. But we have a collaborative conservation grant for a couple of years to try, lots of conservation orgs in small places compete against each other. So the grant's intention was to pull them together instead of fighting for volunteers, basically.
I have a question. Hey, Carrie. So in the Department of Architecture, we are branching into film production as part of our communication aspect.
Yeah.
And just thinking about creating the film, as you somewhat alluded to, there were difficulties. You think about the length of things. Did you guys incorporate any type of editing consultation or storytelling? And I know you're a storyteller too, but how did you guys negotiate that process?
So I have, this is probably why it's good that you're not going to see the film. We followed sort of the practices of building a storyboard out and then tried to create it, but we didn't have the footage for it. So at the end of the day, the student team has put together in consult, gotten back and forth with the WhatsApp and the kids on the island. What do you want the vision to be? And then we are doing we're not doing any voiceover, but we are doing some word over and transitions, and we've got photos and other footage.
Yeah, but even just like the shortcuts to get to the...
Yeah, I mean, we've got hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage.
Right.
And the film, it started at like 58 minutes, and I got it back to a little under 30, because we don't want it to be longer than that. Yeah, it's hard.
3-minute clips.
What's that?
3-minute clips.
3 minutes is a long time.
It is a long time, and so they're just thinking about how when we do collaborate, and another way to disseminate information, I think it's really important, because film is like the up and coming way to transcend your ideas.
Right, and what these organizations have asked for, I don't know if this might be relevant for other people, is they wanted 30-second clips that they could then put on their social media. So they've asked us to pull out different things that are relevant to the work that they're doing. And that's a way that this is things that probably they could do, but they don't have the time because they're all understaffed. So it's something that our students feel like they're really adding value.
So hello. So when you're thinking about, you want to do a project and you need funding for it, could you talk a little bit about how you think about the timeline of kind of when is the planning happening? How do you think about when would the funding come, and then making sure other things are ready at that time too?
Yeah, that sounds good. So I'm constantly looking for funding. I feel like someone's here to. You're going.
I'm here to learn.
But in my film, probably like a lot of you, we don't have many funding sources for the kind of work that we do. So I'm often looking for funding for my own theoretical research interests. And then a lot of this small scale stuff is pretty small and one-off, and those timelines are different. There's a wonderful office that can point you towards funding.
I've been in yours.
Funding opportunities, but the trick is the timeline is, and I think that's the partnership piece. Pamela asked to do this film like a year and a half ago, and my colleague and I said, we'll self-fund it. Like, I mean, it wouldn't cost that much if we do it low budget. We aren't going to do it fancy. We're like, we'll come up with something, and then we'll do the scope funding, and so we cobbled together a few $1,000s. They used to, the first project I told you about was funded through the Engaged Scholarship Fund on campus. That's gone away. So those were nice little 5,000 to support something like this. And they're quick turnaround, so you can have an idea and know within 4 or 5 months. I don't think I answered your question, but it's just, I think it's a struggle, I guess is the answer.
Are there rules against the GoFundMe? Mary can answer that, but
Yeah.
with the Department of Architecture partner with
Yeah.
Anthropology, we tried to do something, we run the GoFundMe account.
Yeah.
How does the university do that?
Oh, that would be terrible. We didn't do it through the university.
No, but their GoFundMe was from the organization.
Yep.
That was on their side?
Yep.
Okay. Just curious.
Yeah.
I think our development office has its own GoFundMe type thing.
They have the momentum.
That's what I'm,
Momentum.
that's what
right.
that is.
The momentum. But those aren't necessarily, maybe they could be for research.
And I think certainly if you were pitching something to be engaged scholarship,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
maybe sounds more studenty than it does researchy, even
Right.
though there are two goals there.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about a GoFundMe for university activities. Something I would work with development on, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that the department can do that.
Can I ask a question about so you said when you gave the iPads to the young people on the island and it just like utterly failed with them trying to make this on their own. Can you talk about like how you overcame that? Because I feel like that's something that often happens in these long-term projects that have some sort of digital component,
Yes.
that they just fall
So it
apart halfway
didn't-
through.
Yes, I think that's a good, practical, important question. So it didn't utterly fail. But what's interesting is if you look at what didn't fail was they did really take to doing the interviews and capturing footage. But what we did notice was every time I left the island, somehow things would fall dormant for a long time. and then you can see, like, they were taking a picture, I'm there. I'm doing the interview when they're supposed to be doing the interview, right? So they would get momentum, I would leave, or I'd be there, and there'd be a lot of momentum. And they really enjoyed it. We interviewed the kids at the end, and they're young, so they really did enjoy the project. But the thing that failed was the editing process. So they were really good at doing the creating questions, leading an interview with some guidance, but once we left, if we weren't sitting side by side to talk through the editing process, it was over their heads, I think. It was over my head. And so we had to find a different solution. We actually tried to partner with the communications department, journalism, but that didn't work. No, nothing wrong with journalism, but we couldn't find a student. But that would be one solution, to find a student here that had that skill set.
So what did you end up doing, like to get?
We took the iPad back. Oh, so that's what happened. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
That was a much more simple response. So the LumaVision stuff wasn't working, and I said, all right, and now we only could raise enough money for one iPad, actually. I said, I'll take the equipment back, and then I'm going to bring it back in a month or two. And so we'll get it done. We'll get it done on our side. And so I put my GA on it, and she spent like 6 months trying to work on this app, this LumaVision. If you learn anything today, don't use LumaVision. And it was a lot of wasted energy. And then eventually my daughter, who is 15, said, why aren't you just doing it in iMovie? I'll do it over winter break. And so she started to. And then I came back and said, hey, Amelie thought maybe we could do this in iMovie. And my GA said, we probably could, but I was afraid to, because I was afraid to offer another idea, right? But yeah, we did it. And, yeah.
Whereas your daughter wasn't.
Whereas
your daughter wasn't.
Never going to be afraid. Yeah, we ended up doing it, but we did have a conversation, and that's where the WhatsApp came in. We were in the Skype, we were visually talking with them. like what, they don't want to show a bad image of their island. And so they're like, don't show that clip, only show this clip. Don't tell that story, which is interesting and fascinating to me as a scholar about representation.
How did you get the undergrads involved? Then what did you say the team is like?
Honors program.
Oh, okay. Just practical.
Honors
yeah,
research, they
okay.
will be paid honors research. So I offered it as an honors research opportunity. So two of them were paid on the project, which is a really great way to get some help and motivate students. And our honor students are really good.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Gary. So our next speaker is Donald Harris, and he is assistant professor in the English department, and he works on 20th century American literature. And he is going to talk about his experience working on correspondence. No, yes. Circulation.
Oh, is there something?
Did I just do?
I think just middle. Middle of the table?
Middle of the table.
On.
No, I'm using it.
There we go.
Hi, I'm Donald. I'm in the English department. I don't have nearly as much experience in doing digital humanities or collaborative work as Carrie, so this will be much more bare bones. So I'll give a little bit of background on one of the projects that I've worked on, and then because the other term for this workshop was funding, I'm just going to go through some of the funding sources that I've found in I'm also I feel like an imposter, or maybe I'm like DH curious. So this is just in my own attempt to try and figure out how to get some of that DH money that I found. Okay, so my project is called, the project I'm part of is called Circulating American Magazines. And part of what Melanie asked me to talk about was how I got involved in a collaborative project in the first place. So this is just a little bit about that actual project, but I'm not a lead on this. I'm on the advisory board, and if you're new to this stuff, I feel like it's hard to become the lead on a new DH project because of the lead time on the amount of work that needs to go in before you get a grant or a fellowship, and because it's hard to conceptualize something that's not in your field. And so I thought this was a really great way for me to get a little bit of experience collaborating on a digital humanities project. So I met the co-directors, Brooks and Ed, at a conference. We all work on 20th century American periodicals. I wrote a book about early 20th century magazines in the US. And I was on a panel with one of the co-directors about early 20th century magazines, and he said, hey, I work at James Madison, and we're in the process, a year out from now, we're going to apply for an NEH grant for this digital project on circulation numbers. So the weird thing about working on early magazines is that circulation data is almost impossible to get with any sort of reliable circulation numbers. Almost everyone relies on self-reported numbers by the magazines themselves. There's this organization called the Audit Bureau of Circulation, and you can get their summary reports really easily, which are basically articles that people there wrote about, trends in circulation for a given year. But to get to the actual circulation numbers, nobody really knew where those documents were. And so prior to, I can show you what this website looks like. So prior to any sort of funding, Brooks and Ed basically tracked down every annual volume of the ABC's numbers, which are at the Library of Congress, the University of Chicago, Emory, and one or two other research libraries. and had to actually find them and catalog what those were before they applied for any money, without an actual, you know, guarantee that the project would be able to go anywhere. And so what they asked, I met them in 2016, so a year out, so it was funded officially from 2017 to 2018. And what they asked me and a couple other people to do was just to start to think about research projects that you could produce from this information, from the data that they would take, what sort of visualizations you would like, what sort of comparisons you'd like you'd be able to like, what sort of social questions you'd like to ask that you could ask from the material, so that when it came time for them to write their grant, they could say, we have people who work in this field who are interested in the data for these particular projects that will be, you know, that will further the research. So I was adjacent to the actual grant writing and the conceptualization of the project, but I became more involved as the project got funded. So they received word in 2017 that they had initial funding. It's a Humanities Advancement Grant from the NEH, which I'm going to explain in a second. But so once it got the funding, they had all of the advisory board. They basically sent us photocopies of some of the pages and said, here's what the information looks like. How do you want our coders to be able to compare this? So they are the co-directors, but there's 3 people who are in charge of the project, or 2 people in charge of the project, and 3 people who are in charge of making sense of all of the information and taking it from an old book and putting it into databases and then converting that into web searchable and web visualizable web pages. So for some reason, the web page itself isn't fully up. Anyway, you can, it's, if you just Google circulating American magazines, it'll pull up. So it's the whole project is housed at James Madison University, but it's people from 13 different institutions who are collectively working on it. And this is why I asked you about what happens when things go wrong, because things just continuously went wrong. And things took 3 times as long as they were supposed to take when they had set out a project timeline. So it was only officially funded from 2017 to 2018, but we're still working on it. It still doesn't have any sort of visualization tools on the website. It has a lot of the raw data, but it doesn't have anything where you can compare. It has dummy pages so that you can compare by geographical reach, you can compare circulation over time, you can do longitudinal studies of it. But the hope is to have something available by the end of the summer of 2019, so a year and a half later than it was initially expected to be finished. So that's something that I've learned through this project, is just how much front-end work before you even get to the stage where you can apply for any kind of money is required. And then how you have to sort of prepare for the fact that the end result might not be exactly what you were looking for, and that you have to be more flexible in terms of what you can actually produce. And I've done a couple, I didn't put them on here, I can few questions. I've done a couple things by by having digital writing assignments as the end project of classes that I did for the University Special Collections website, and then for the Memphis Flyer, and now I'm doing one for Story Booth, Memphis Story Booth, a new monthly magazine, which have all not gone how they were supposed to go. So I think especially when you get students involved, it makes it difficult. But it's another one where you just have to be, I've learned to be more flexible. Okay, so that's my experience with actually working on digital humanities projects. And now I'm just going to talk about resources for people who are interested in this. So the one that I have found really useful just to keep abreast of what's going on is this website called Digital Humanities Now. So it's kind of a clearinghouse for all of the DH News and notices that are going out in lots of people's different feeds. So it's a very social media oriented semi-publication. So people submit RSS feeds as possible things to follow who are interested in the field. And then they employ these they ask for the work of volunteer editors at large, who then aggregate all of that information that's coming in through the RSS feed. So it could be like a library's Twitter feed or a scholar who's in the field's Facebook page or whatever. So these volunteer editors read all of that material. They rank it by usefulness. And they nominate a cold list to the editor-in-chief, who works at, it's a collection of people who work at George Mason in one of their digital media centers. And then that person, or those people, put together a neater list of possibilities that are calls for papers, grant opportunities, calls for collaborators and research. I've just found it really useful in terms of, as someone who came in not knowing very much about digital humanities other than as being sort of, I don't know, like a content specialist on that DH project, this was really useful just to get abreast of what was going on in the field. So they don't actually offer any fellowships or grants on their own, but it's a place that collates that information. So again, this is a place that, this is information that you can probably find out somewhere else, but the Office of Digital Humanities at the NEH is the biggest provider of grants for these kinds of projects. And they have a couple different areas in which they fund. So digging into data is one of their primary funding target areas. So this is anything where you're using you're taking analog or print-based information and you're digitizing it for use for a wider scholarly audience. The Humanities Open Book Program is probably not applicable to us because it's for university presses and libraries that have older print runs of scholarly publications that have gone out of print. And this is the Humanities Open Book Program is a way to digitize and then make this freely available. And then the Digital Humanities Advancement Grants, that's the one that funded our project. And this is, these are sort of long-term, year, 2-year, 3-year, big amounts of money to fund the startup of these projects, of large-scale projects. Okay, so here's a breakdown of what they do for these humanities advancement grants. And I put these due dates up here because you can see that the application is due June 19th. But when Brooks and Ed started planning for applying for one of these, they did it basically a year and a half in advance because it required so much initial data to even justify the existence of the project. Okay, so that's the digital humanities advancement grants. And I think Melanie's going to talk about, I might be putting words in your mouth, but I think we're going to talk about some of the projects that they define, specific projects. So that was under the offices of digital humanities. They fund those for research areas or target areas. But there's a couple other programs that NEH has that aren't under the ODH that might be applicable depending on the sort of product you want to produce with this research. So one of them that seems pretty applicable is the digital projects for the public. So this is under the Division of Public Programs, not the Digital Humanities Institute or Digital Humanities Office. And the goal here is not to produce scholarly material, and the audience cannot be academics or university audiences. It's supposed to be for a non-specialist audience. So this goes, a lot of times what they'll fund is supplementary digital materials for a museum exhibition. They do some more experimental stuff, like they did a video game of Thoreau's Walden Pond. That was funded through a library. but this is just a possibility for that's digitally based, but not in the offices of digital humanities. And they actually offer 3 kinds of awards too. So depending on the state of your project or how you're thinking about it, you can apply it 3 different types. And they encourage you, if you get the prototyping, to work through the stages of funding. And here's one. This is probably most applicable to people who do library sciences and history, but this is something that I've always wanted to do because I work in early periodicals, but have just never found the temporal resources to take care of it. So the Library of America and NEH have this program called Chronicling America, where they're digitizing all of these pre-1922 American newspapers, and they're looking for the widest possible reach in terms of geographic and geographic reach as possible. So we have our special collections has the morgues of several old Memphis newspapers that have never been digitized, and this seems like a great opportunity. This gets, as everyone I'm sure knows, like NEH grants get funded at like a 5% clip or something. But the Chronicling America grants get funded at like an 80% clip. So there's the chances of receiving one with a well-conceived project are much higher. And these are again long-term, usually two-year grants, long-term for a humanities person anyway, it's used to a semester. And they require you to pair, you have to come up with a subject or a content area specialist, a librarian, and somebody who's going to handle the actual digitization process. And they provide resources for a lot of that material. But this, I mean, I don't know if there's any history or history grad students, but this would be a good project for that. And then just one other possible place is ACLS has these digital extension grants. They used to have prototyping grants that they've since gotten rid of, but these are to support digitally based research projects that are collaborative in their organization. And they're specifically, why I wanted to bring this up is because one of the things that they're trying to support is bringing in new collaborators to already existing projects. So if there's something like, so WashU's right now is doing a digital project, doing oral history and archiving of all of the protests after the killing of Michael Brown. So they have a Mellon fund for that, to do that work. But something like the ACLS Digital Extension Grant, if University of Memphis could partner with what WashU's doing, do a similar style project for like the Take 'em Down 901 event, or when Black Lives Matter shut down Highway 40. These are some of the things that these digital extension, it's an extension of the scope of the project to increase more collaborators. So this is a possible way to, piggyback on someone else's work that they've already got underway to bring it to our school. And then this is, I was just trying to think of how the resources that I always look for, even when I'm not looking for digital specific fellowships and grants, and the ACLS's collaborative research grant seemed like a great place. It's not specifically for digital projects, it's just for collaborative projects, but that's not to say that you can't pitch a digital project to the collaborative research grant. They're not doing it this year, but the Mellon funding is in flux right now. They're planning on doing it again next year. But this is something that that doesn't have to be a huge research team. This isn't like the 13 people in my team or the Stanford Literary Lab or whatever that has 30 or 40 people. It only has to be 2 collaborators in different disciplines. I don't even think they necessarily have to be at different institutions. But this just seems like a way to use available research funds to that aren't digital specific or DH specific, but to pitch a DH project for those, for that money. And I think that's all I have. Yeah.
Great, okay, questions?
Oh, here's one. Is the last one from ACLS about collaborative research grants, is that limited to collaborators based at American institutions?
That is a good question. I would assume so, but I don't know that for certain. So I can put this PowerPoint somewhere that everyone can access it. I don't know, but it's got links to all of those. The titles have links to all of those websites. So on
We'll figure out something.
MOCH website or something like that.
What is the? Could you say the URL for the big project you're on? I
Oh
couldn't
yeah,
find
it's called. So it's circulatingamericanmagazines.org.
Okay.
Oh, pull up now. Yeah, and if you go, you see it has like a lot of the traditional humanities style information that's there. There's a bunch of research on the history of auditing periodical circulation numbers. There's a lot of like footnotes to all of these materials, but then when it gets to the actual DH part, none of it exists yet because it's taking forever to actually get that part organized.
Okay, so I'm going to try to speak a little bit briefer because I think I've already talked about this presentation, and I actually have a lot of the same things to say as you did. So I really want to talk about the shift that's happened in digital humanities over the last 5-10 years. So I think initially when people started, they tended to think of these very large projects that were working on, kind of the maximum size. So when I was in grad school, I worked on mapping the Republic of Letters, and this was one of the kind of early large DH projects. It was mostly in history, and looking at the way that letters circulate in Europe between 1500 and 1800. And so, letters, it brings in arts, science, anything you can put in a letter, friendship, marriages. And so one of the key things there was to break the projects up into manageable sort of chunks. And so we ended up with the letters of Algarati, Condorcet, D'Alembert, Voltaire, and all of those being significant intellectual figures with long traditions of scholarship. So you can't just go in and say, okay, I looked at the numbers on D'Alembert's letters and so now I'm an expert, right? People within that field expect you to be an expert of D'Alembert as well as 18th century France as well as the Enlightenment. And so even within each project you need a certain number of people who have different specializations. Some of the early work was actually some of the biggest. So there was actually an undergraduate student who created this visualization. I hope it plays its flash. It was playing earlier. Okay. So visualization of all the letters in Europe, and we'll talk about that. All the letters in Europe over a 250-year period. So you can see the top cities in correspondence. You can see them lighting up. You can look at the flow of letters, different kinds of visualizations. The letter flow. I'm sorry, the flash. It's supposed to be a lot faster than that, but anyway. And then you can look at connections between people. You can select particular people and look only at their network. So there's a certain amount of ability to navigate through the data, and there is this factor of like big visualization, like wow, right? Like all the letters. But few things. So this visualization and a lot of the early projects are based on the Electronic Enlightenment database. So they're based on basically books of correspondence from these major figures. So it's, the correspondence of Voltaire, it's the correspondence of Galileo. And therefore, it's very French-centric, it's very English-centric, it's very much, centered on these kind of great men of history. So then the next step was to kind of step back and say, okay, we don't actually have all the letters in Europe, right? And we're probably not going to get all the letters in Europe. So by having teams that break out and say just work on Voltaire or Condorcet, they can really dig down and have some really some very meaningful interpretations for that field. My particular project was the SALONS project, so I was looking at, in 18th century France, people who attended salons, who tend to be the same people that were in the letters networks, and also looking at academies. So I think the key things to take away from my experience would be that you really have to think about the field that you're hoping to contribute to. And I personally believe that you want to think about research questions in that field that are already articulated. There's a sort of debate within digital humanities. Are we trying to present something completely new, or are we trying to answer, traditional questions? I personally believe it's much more traditional questions with new methods. And so when you do have these kinds of large projects, one of the main things people can do is help with things like methods. If somebody figures out how to make a map, they can share that. If somebody, figures out how to do some statistical analysis, they can share that. But at the end of the day, the projects and the conclusions have to stand alone, and you have to be able to say to, to a Franklin scholar, this is actually what I believe about Franklin's correspondence. There has been this movement from these very large projects that discovered, oops, like this is too big. We can't actually work on all of this at once. Let's break up into smaller teams. And then I think that's where I agree with what Donald had to say. Now there's much more of a push towards subject experts, to having people who can actually oversee this part of the project and make sure that part is good. A lot of that, I think, has been trying to get away from Eurocentrism and the kind of English centrism that we find in digital humanities. So sometimes people do want the person who's working on China, they want the person who's working on maybe Native Americans, and trying to get away from the Eurocentric perception. But I think it is also just about a sort of level of reverence for the field. So in terms of getting started, I do think that one of the best things that you can do is look through previous projects. So of course there are a lot of previously funded projects, and they may be looking for collaborators, and sort of looking through with an eye of not, oh, this person does what I do, but like actually they need me. There's a gap in this project. They really should be looking at this author. They really should be looking at these texts. And then by being on the advisory board or collaborating, you can learn a lot of the tools of writing grant proposals and those sorts of things. But I think that one of the most important aspects, even when you do have such a small collaborative project, is still this kind of authority attribution. Because we were discussing this last week. In some fields, really collaboration is not approved. But I feel like for a lot of these projects, if we don't have a huge amount of funding to get started, especially when you're trying to get your proof of concept and get something you can show to the granting agency, you at least have to be giving people research credit. So whether that's other people, the other faculty members at the university, whether that's graduate students, whether that's undergraduate students, I think that is a discussion that we have to have. So those were my main insights. And so, yeah, I think we talked about the larger Mellon grants, we talked about the larger NEH grants. I think that is quite a reach for us at this time. So I'm happy that we looked at some of the smaller grants. I think elsewhere we want to look regionally, and so we're putting together a list of local grants that could be, for example, maybe smaller public history grants, extension grants, these kinds of things, and then also things that are specifically for Tennessee. And so if you do have any grant requirements, or if you're looking for a specific kind of grant, if you could email me as much information So it's mrconroy@memphis.edu. And then I'm also putting together a listserv. So when we do have grant opportunities, we're also going to email those out and try to share them as widely as possible. Maybe not even just the members of this group, but just to people in the humanities who might have some kind of interest in digital humanities. Does anyone have any comments or questions for any of the presenters? Well, thank you so much for coming, guys. So yeah, this is our kind of halfway point with the course. I really appreciate, the workshops have been excellent this semester. We're going to try to continue next semester, so if there's something you really want to see, please email me. So far we're thinking of doing Omeka, because there was a lot of desire to create expositions, and then we were talking about R or some kind of like textual analysis, but if you have any other ideas, please feel free to email me.